Hello, my name is Loyd. I have a master's in psychology, neuropsychology concentration. Today I wanted to read something from socialequity.duke.edu. It's titled Fact Check: What percentage of white Southerners owned slaves? This was written by Anne Brown, and it's a 5 to 6 minute read. In fact, it has a image here of looks like two boys who were slaves, and then an old record behind that picture of the two slaves. It's a census of 1860. It has the states listed in the first column from 1 to 11: South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, Texas. I can't see the number 10, but I see Tennessee. And it has the population, the total, the amount of slaves, and everything there. So just under that image, it says, fact check: what percentage of white Southerners actually owned slaves? Reparations activist Dr. Sandy Darity helps to set the record straight. Image: the Bell Breezing Photograph Collection, 2003, AV1, Special Collections, University of Kentucky. Kentuckiana Digital Library via University of Kentucky. When it comes to reparations, one of the consistent arguments against them is that there were actually not very many white slave owners in the U.S. recently. Reparations activist Duke Professor William Sandy Darity disputed this on Twitter. He posted, quote, one quote, lie circulating that only 1% of white Southerners owned slaves. That's hashtag FHTE. In 1860, 1% of white Southern families owned 200 or more human beings. But in states of the Confederacy, at least 20% owned at least one. And in looks like Mississippi and South Carolina, it ran as high as 50%. Darity cited a chart and research by U.S. Civil War expert Al Mackey to back up his statement. Others have refuted Darity's claim, denying that slaves enriched their white owners. Greg at Blancon X360 replied to Darity's tweet, quote, yes, but in the case of South Carolina, most of these were not large plantations like in Gone with the Wind on the coast, but they were smaller farms. The owners were not getting rich. They were fighting for survival as cotton and tobacco prices were on a roller coaster. According to Mackey, the 1% figure is misleading and needs to be understood. Mackey is an educator, a retired U.S. Air Force officer, and a former human resources manager with the global company. He has become an expert on the U.S. Civil War and writes a blog called, quote, Student of the American Civil War. Quote, For generations, historians have been almost unanimous in emphasizing that black slaves were owned by a surprisingly small minority of whites, Mackey wrote. But this figure mainly comes from the research of American history Alan Nevins, the research of American historian Alan Nevins, 1890 through 1971. In the 1850 census, of the 6,184,477 white folk in the slave states, only 347,525 were listed as owners, found Nevin. In the 1860 census, which is on the eve of the Civil War, there were 393,975 slave owners in the United States out of a total population of 31,183,582, or 1.2% of the population, 1.26% of the population. This is not a unique picture, wrote Mackey. The figure is the population of the entire U.S. at the United States. At the time, there were 33 states in the Union, 15 slave states, and 18 were free states. Looking just at the slave states then, there were 393,975 slave owners in the slave states out of a population of 12,240,293. So this meant that 3.22% of the population of the 15 slave states were slave owners. So of the slave states, 3.22% of the population were slave owners. But it gets even trickier, right? So it says, but, quote, but we have to remember that only free people owned slaves, and that the total population of the slave states included enslaved people themselves. So we have to adjust our numbers to reflect only free people. Therefore, the 393,975 slave owners were out of a free population of a little bit less, which is 8,289,782, or 4.75% of the free population of the slave states were slave owners. That's what Mackey wrote, end quote. The Confederacy's 11 states had 316,000. Now this is, I guess, during the Confederacy now. 11 states of the Confederacy had 316,632 slave owners. And this was out of a free population of only 5,582,222 people. So this equals 5.67% of the free population of the Confederacy were slave owners. That's during the time of the Civil War. There were a greater population of slave owners per free slave owners per person in total population during the Civil War. It even gets trickier still. Quote, that, however, does not tell us the extent of slave ownership. And even this, I had to take a second. I was like, what? To better understand the extent of slavery's impact, we need to realize a slave owner was the one person in a family who legally owned slaves. That person was usually the patriarch. There would be a spouse and sons and daughters who directly benefited from the family's slave ownership and who stood to inherit the enslaved people, wrote Mackey. So, according to the census of 1860, that would be 30.8% of the free families in the Confederacy owned slaves. So now we're including the family because they only really included one person in the census as owning them, but the family owned them because they were passed down. This means that every third white person in those states had a direct commitment to slavery. I thought that was pretty interesting, so I wanted to share that with you. It says, listen to GHOGH with Jamarlin Martin, episode 73. Jamarlin, that's with a J, Martin. Jamarlin makes the case for why this is a multi-factor rebellion versus just protests about George Floyd. He discusses the Democratic Party's sneaky relationship with the police in cities and states under Dem control, and why Joe Biden is a cop and the Steve Jobs of mass incarceration. So that is a lot of slave owners, it says, the free labor these slaves provided, and how the slave owners profited financially from slavery are just some of the reasons why hashtag ADOS continues to fight for reparations for Native Black Americans. Once again, this is Eric Michael Loyd. I have a master's in psychology, neuropsychology concentration. I'm reading Fact Check. What percentage of white Southerners owned slaves? This is the reader view from socialequity.duke.edu. This was published August 11th, 2020, and it was written by Anne Brown. Thank you for your time.